welcome to another episode of
Monday afternoon theologians.
Recording in progress.
Hey, hello there, Rick and fellow theologians. Welcome to another
Monday afternoon.
That theme seems kind of familiar.
Does it?
It does. I'm remembering back to the late 60s and early 70s for a program that we used to watch called Hogan's Heroes.
Hogan's Heroes. I remember that. And here again, I thought I was just making stuff up as I went along.
That was a fairly long-running show for a 60s sitcom.
Yeah, as I recall, it ran for 6 whole seasons from 1965 to 1971. And don't ask me how I know that.
All right, I won't ask. You're just going to tell us. We don't have to ask.
That's right. It was a good show, though. I love that the Sergeant Schultz, I see nothing, I hear nothing.
He's kind of an interesting character who just wanted to put his head in the sand and not really see what all of those prisoners were actually doing right under his big fat nose.
Yes, that's true. We had that Bob Hogan, Colonel Hogan, who was played by Bob Crane. Personal tragedy in his life later on, but great role that he played in this particular sitcom. He was the U.S. Armed Air Forces captain, as I recall, who had been shot down, and he was coordinating this crazy international crew of hilarious Allied prisoners.
Yeah, because they had one who was French, there was one who was English. It was a very diverse group, and they were all in a German prisoner of war camp.
Yeah, POW camp. Yeah. They called it Stalag 13.
They did, as if it was an unlucky number.
Right. And they had that special tunnel underneath one of the bunk beds, and they could go outside anytime they wanted to. So they were running all these ops.
They had a radio built into the coffee pot. The bunk would slide up and there'd be a ladder down into the tunnel. It's just goofy, but they could go outside the camp. Sometimes they were dressed as German soldiers. Sometimes they were dressed as German people. And you thought, why in the world don't they just run away since they've escaped from the camp? But they never did. They always went back. And it must have been because they were getting orders across the radio to find out something that would be useful to the Allied forces, that would be good for the war cause.
That's very true, because they would be passing along very important intelligence. And I'm sure that they had a real mission to do right there in that POW camp. Crazy. Some of those specialized skills were really fun, too. It was really cool to see that come into play.
Yeah, there's one guy who was like a bomb specialist, and it was almost a MacGyver kind of thing. They could make something out of nothing or whatever they needed.
Yep.
And sometimes the little Frenchman would be sewing costumes so that they would fit in when they left camp. I always wondered, they had an awful lot of resources for a POW camp.
Yes, they did. Good props department. I know this is a little off topic, perhaps, but I thought I was going to get a specialized skill just a few days ago.
Really? That sounds interesting. Tell me more.
Oh, well, I'm glad you asked. Yes, I was stung. Is it bit or stung by a spider? Are you bit by spider bit?
Probably
spider bite?
Bit. You get a spider bite or a biter spite. If you
Biter spite.
Yeah.
To spite that spider, I was bit, but I got bit on the ball of my right foot. And I'm pretty sure it was a spider by the way it reacted. I think it probably got me because I only wore my socks out to the mailbox. And I suspect that spider got me when I stepped onto the grass, because when I got in and sat down for supper a few minutes later, I felt something under my foot, like mostly solid, but a little squishy. And it felt like I had put my foot down on a really good sized chunk of my dog's or my daughter's dog's food, maybe one of her squeaky toys, but it wasn't squeaking. And I thought, that's crazy. So then I looked at my foot and it was starting to bruise and it was really swollen. And I thought, well, maybe this is cool. Maybe if I was spider bit, I'll develop some super spidey senses.
Spidey sense.
Oh, that would be fun.
It would be. My daughter asked me if I could detect something about to happen, like if somebody was about to do some harm to somebody else. And I said, Yeah, from about 6 feet away. Like if she were in the kitchen and she picked up a skillet and she was going to hurl it at my head, I'd be able to detect that.
Yeah, that would be good to do, but 6 feet is not very far away. So,
Yeah, I was hoping it might expand a little bit. And then a little bit later, I heard a train whistle that was blowing because our window was open. But that's about 2 miles away. But I said, that's farther than 6 feet. So maybe I'm developing that sense. But Callie wasn't very kind. She said, well, my untrained ears detect the very same thing, though. So I thought, oh, man,
yeah, it doesn't sound like that spidey sense was coming in too strong.
it wasn't. And my foot is almost back to normal today. The swelling's gone down. The black and blue rings are almost completely gone. And I'm still unable to detect anything nefarious beyond about 6 feet. So I'm kind of afraid that the whole
Spidey sense.
specialty thing might not happen.
Yes, sounds like it might be a little out there to think that's going to work.
Shucks. Well, I'm a little disappointed, but I guess I'll just have to revert back to the old spiritual gifts that God has already given me. I'll just have to be content with those.
Spiritual gifts are not anything to sneeze at,
No.
because that would actually be kind of rude. But um,
Like the team of specialists in Hogan's Heroes, they each had their specialty, as you have just eloquently expressed. And so together, they were able to pull off some pretty cool stuff.
well, superhero stuff is interesting in and of itself. But those spiritual gifts, those are pretty cool too.
Mhm.
We've been exploring that in a project that we're working on, and don't want to give too much away, but let's just say that there's something in the offing that will be pretty interesting that has to do with spiritual gifts and how they're expressed in the real world.
Bum, bum, bum.
I like it. And whether you use the word we there, it's kind of like we killed a bear, because I think you are doing most of the work on this project and I get to just sort of voyeur into it and say, ooh, that's coming along really nicely.
To me, that's a very important part of the project.
Well, you're very kind, but I'm excited by what you're putting together. And that's all I want to say about that, because I don't want to give away too much.
Back to our regularly scheduled programming.
Yes.
Based on the theme of specialty skills
Mhm.
and a team of people doing special ops,
Mhm.
I am curious to see what the
Dartboard of Destiny
will tell us that we need to look at today. So why don't you see what it suggests?
I'll do just that. Here's the dart. Let's see. I keep thinking that one of these days I'm going to do that and I'm going to hear a cat go. But not this day. Let's see. What do we have today? Uh-oh. Oh, yeah, this makes total sense. Fits right in with what we've been talking about. The specialty of an unusual crew like Hogan's Heroes. And it's called
David's Mighty Men.
Ah, yes, a skilled group of men who are able to pull off something amazing in the form of a special op. And then they encouraged their king when he needed to boost his spirits.
Mhm.
They were simply known as the 30 or the 30 chiefs,
Mhm. And if they cooked, it would be the 30 chefs.
but they didn't.
They
At
didn't.
least not in this story.
Not in this story. They're just the chiefs in this story. Right. And where in the Bible would we find information about the
Mighty Men.
of David?
Well, we can find quite a bit of information in two places. We've got
Mhm.
2 Samuel 23 and 1 Chronicles 11.
Gotcha. I recall, I think, from these passages that some of these mighty men had some specialized military skills and that they were blessed by God because they were helping to protect the king. Is that right?
That's right. And you could say that these mighty men of David were like the secret service of Israel.
Okay. The protection group. Very cool. Are you thinking about the same mighty men special ops incident that I'm thinking about?
Would that be the one about getting something special that the king had wished for?
That's the one.
All right. In fact, this is a special operation that reminds me of another long-running sitcom.
Of course it does.
After all, this is,
Season 2.
and we're looking at humor in the Bible. But when it comes to the Monday afternoon theologians, in case you haven't figured this out by now, a lot of stuff reminds us of sitcoms.
Sometimes our lives are sitcoms
And they're turning into long-running sitcoms.
and getting longer every year.
So what sitcom does this Mighty Men of David Special Ops remind you of?
Well, the sitcom was MASH, but there's one particular episode. It's when a group of the MASH soldiers were going to great lengths to get Colonel Potter something that he wanted really bad.
Oh, right. Fill us in on this particular episode, would you?
Now, you remember Radar O'Reilly, right?
Oh, yeah. Radar, played by Gary Berghoff, as I recall.
That's the guy. So he's the guy who basically kept the camp running smoothly with his behind the scene administrative skills.
Yes. And as I recall, too, he was called Radar because it seemed like he had a sixth sense and he could hear choppers coming from miles away before anybody else could. And he seemed to have a sort of spidey sense when it came to knowing something was about to happen.
Right. Unlike your spidey sense, which was almost non-existent.
Right.
So Radar, as always, was trying to take care of his CO. And in this particular episode, the thing Radar thinks he needs to please his commanding officer is tomato juice.
Yeah. Don't you mean tomato juice?
I say tomato, you say tomato.
Okay.
And you remember BJ, that BJ Honeycutt.
Oh, yeah, of course. Good old Captain Honeycutt, played by Mike Farrell, as I recall.
Right. Well, he had an important role to play in this episode as well.
Mm-hmm.
But as always, there had to be complications, and there were a lot of these exchanges that had to take place for Radar to get the tomato juice.
Tomato juice.
Tomato juice for Colonel Potter.
Okay.
Now, the short version is Frank Burns, was the designated procurement officer. So he had to order the tomato juice, and he wouldn't do it unless the guys would get him a pair of nylons. Now, that wasn't for him. Apparently, it was supposed to be a gift for one of the nurses. And then, of course, since we're dealing with nylons, then Klinger had to come in.
Yes.
So he would be the one who would have access to the nylons.
Mm-hmm.
But of course, then he wanted something. He wanted to go to Seoul and he needed a pass. But he couldn't get the pass unless Colonel Potter would give it to him. But Colonel Potter had to get in touch with General Bradley because there was a bunch of stuff going on in Seoul. And General Bradley wanted Hot Lips to come out to an event that he was producing. And of course, it gets really super complicated. And everybody's trying to get what they need. They don't want to get caught. Everything's in the wrong place. Everybody's swapping something with somebody else, just so they can come up with a can of tomato juice. Don't even think about it. So, in typical hilarious MASH fashion, it comes across like a Keystone Cops movie.
It sounds like it. Just hearing you describe it's enough to make me crack up. But what is the outcome, though? Did they finally get the tomato juice?
Of course they did. It would be kind of a silly episode if they didn't. But
Yeah.
After all the running around, after all the negotiation, after all the bartering back and forth, Radar gets the tomato juice. He pours a glass and presents it to Colonel Potter, who kind of looks at it like, I'm not sure about this. And Radar's kind of, disappointed in the reaction. And Colonel Potter goes, I love tomato juice, but it doesn't love me. So we're kind of getting the impression that there might have been some sort of a little GI issue that was coming as a result of the tomato juice.
And we're not talking GIs as in soldiers here, a different kind of GI, right? Yeah.
That's right. There was no GI Joe, no GI Jane. It was just tomato juice and a potential problem that Colonel Potter had with tomato juice. And of course, it was the big letdown, but yet quite humorous because MASH is always funny.
It was indeed. Love that show. That's crazy. And it is kind of similar in several respects to this story about the
Mighty Men
of King David, as a matter of fact.
It is, isn't it? You wonder if just maybe the writer of the tomato juice episode had been inspired by the story we're looking at today. Yeah, probably not.
Probably not.
So why don't you give us the setup?
Okay. We see a sort of army camp, similar in some respects to this MASH unit because it's a temporary setup. It's hidden away from the front lines. And we find out where this takes place in 2 Samuel 23. The Israelite army, which David is commanding at this time as king, was attempting to capture the city of Bethlehem, where David had been born and raised. Bethlehem, the city of David. The problem is that Bethlehem has been surrounded by the enemy, in this case, the Philistines.
Philistines.
I say Philistines, you say Philistines.
Let's move on before we beat this dead horse once too often.
Okay, of course. Well, David and many of his men were camped out at the cave of Adullam, where he felt pretty discouraged.
Haven't we heard of this cave before?
You have a good memory. Yes, indeed we have. We learn about this cave in 1 Samuel 19, because when David was younger and was running away from King Saul, who wanted David killed, David sought refuge among the Philistines in Gath. But he soon realized that it wasn't a really great idea to hide there because it was pretty dangerous. So David then moved off somewhere else and wound up at the cave of Adullam. Well, David's brothers and his father's household heard about where he was, so they went down there to join him. And that cave and the surrounding rocks and crags and other little minor caves near En Gedi, where Joy and I have actually visited in Israel before, became a hideout, and there was lots of fresh water. So it was a great spot for them. And it became sort of a fortress for them. And at one time, believe it or not, there were about 400 men with David right there at the cave of Adullam.
Pretty big cave.
It was a big cave, yes. And you could see from the upper levels that there were numerous caves, some of them that were actually adjoined. And so you could fit quite a few people around there. It became, in a sense, like Stalag 13. It was the base of operations for David and his special ops.
Mighty men.
Great. Thanks for that setup. Now, let's look directly at the story, which we find in 2 Samuel 23. Start in verse 13. Once during the harvest, when David was at the cave of Adullam, the Philistine army was camped in the valley of Rephaim. The three, these were the leaders among the leaders, in this group of fighting men were called the 30, and they went down to meet him there. Now, David was staying in the stronghold at that time, and the Philistine detachment had occupied the town of Bethlehem. And David remarked longingly to his men,
"Oh, how I would love some of that good water from the well by the gate in Bethlehem."
So the three broke through the Philistine lines, drew some water from the well by the gate in Bethlehem, and brought it back to David. But he refused to drink it. Instead, he poured it out as an offering to the Lord.
"The Lord forbid that I should drink this,"
he exclaimed.
"This water is as precious as the blood of these men who risked their lives to bring it to me."
So David did not drink it.
And that's the story. Kind of a short story, but it's powerful because it reminds us of not only that sitcom in the MASH episode that you talked about, but what we see is that even though they went to great lengths to procure this specific liquid, not tomato juice, in this case, water, he didn't drink it, even after they went to that trouble. But why would David pour out the water that these men had risked their lives to get?
At first glance, you think, wouldn't that act of pouring the water out seem like a slap in the face to these guys? I mean, it wasn't like he just had to run down to the 7-Eleven and grab a Slurpee. I mean, they had to go through all the Philistines to get it.
Yep. I think you're right. And I would think, just at a surface level, that it would seem like a slap in the face to those guys. But when we understand something about the Jewish culture, and especially about Jewish worship practices, we start to understand that David's act was actually pretty meaningful.
Right. Now, the reason this water was so precious was not because it was super pure or super special or super tasty. It wasn't any better than the water they had in the natural springs near the cave where they were hiding. What made the water special was the emotional memories associated with Bethlehem, which of course was David's hometown.
Yep, that makes sense, because little David had grown up in that town and he had drunk that water from the pool as a child. So it was as though David was longing not just for that water, but he was actually longing for the life he had as a kid.
Yeah, he spoke some wistful words. He says, "Gee, I wish I could drink some of that water again." It wasn't really a command. He was just kind of daydreaming about his home.
Right. So he was basically wishing out loud for Bethlehem to once again be under Israel's control.
But the most courageous of his mighty men, these three, took the king's words to heart.
Yep. Kind of like Radar O'Reilly taking his CO's words about tomato juice to heart.
Kind of like that. But despite the dangers involved, these guys fought their way through the Philistines, got some of the water from that special well, and brought it back to their beloved commander.
But when David realized what they had done and why they had done it, he realized that if he were to drink that water, it would probably look like he had placed greater value on the water itself than on the men who had risked their lives to get it for him.
And that's why he refused to drink it. Instead of doing something that he thought would appear selfish, he poured it out to the Lord.
Yeah, the important thing was that God was involved in the process because God had protected the three men who had risked their lives to get that water. So, in a way, David, by pouring out that water as a drink offering, was actually honoring both God and these soldiers.
Now, in the book of Leviticus, it describes different types of offering that the Jews could give to the Lord.
Mhm.
And one of them was a drink offering. It would be poured out unto the Lord. Now, David recognized that something costly deserved an offering.
Ah, yes. I'm reminded of some other time that we read about, this time in 2 Samuel 24, like the time that somebody offered David a piece of land, a piece of property, so that he could build an altar and offer a burnt offering to the Lord there. But David said, nope, I will not present an offering to the Lord that which costs me nothing.
So there seems to be a theological foreshadowing in this story and in the principle of treating something so costly as an offering rather than taking it in for personal gain.
Definitely. We know that the promised Messiah was going to sit on the throne of David, meaning coming from one of the descendants of David. So for this drink offering of something precious and costly to be poured out by David, that's significant. It's one of those great foreshadowings looking ahead in history at the most important person in history.
Right. Now, we remember that when Jesus was in the upper room with his disciples at the Last Supper before he was arrested, Jesus took a cup and after giving thanks, he gave it to them and all of them drank from it. And he said to them, one of the most powerful things we have in the whole New Testament, this is my blood of the covenant, which is poured out for many.
There's the phrase, poured out for many. Oh, yeah, you're right. That's a heavy one. Sounds like Jesus himself became a drink offering.
Exactly. And it also says in Matthew 26 that Jesus' own blood was poured out for the forgiveness of sin. And that means that many people would benefit from this sacrificial and selfless act of Jesus dying on the cross.
Yeah, I can't help but wonder if there are some lessons that I can learn, both from the mighty men and their willingness to risk their lives in order to please their commander, but also from the way King David honored God by not being selfish with the gift of these men.
So a question comes to mind. Do my gifts to the Lord come from an outflow of blessing, or are they really sacrificial on my part?
Yeah, that's worth thinking about. I remember a guy talking about how he went to a grocery store on the way home from work one day and bought his wife flowers for their anniversary. And he got them home and she looked at them and he could tell she wasn't real pleased, but she knew that they came from their local grocery store. And she said, "You bought grocery store flowers?" And he said, "What? What's wrong with these? They're the same flowers that they sell at the expensive place downtown. Did you want me to buy those flowers?" And she said, "Well, yeah."
Well, this is a story that's kind of near and dear to my heart. I spent most of my career in specialty retail and most of that in the flower business.
Oh, that's right.
I was a floral designer for a long, long time. And there is a difference between the flowers that would come to me as a florist versus those to the grocery store. Now, the grocery stores are getting better, but it's still not quite the same. A lot of times there are production lines that will make these little arrangements and then send them in bulk, already pre-made to the grocery store. In our case, if the guy had come to me, he would say, "I want something for my wife." I would custom make that for him on the spot, pulling out the best flowers that I had in my cooler and making something really pretty for him, as opposed to going down to the grocery store, buying a bunch in a cellophane wrap, that
Mhm.
probably hadn't had the stems cut in quite a while. They may not last quite as long.
Mm.
Whereas when the flowers came into me, I cut them immediately, put them in the bucket of fresh water with flower food because I wanted them to last and last. And we really wanted to take care of them. You don't always see that from your basic grocery store florist. Those expensive flowers from the flower shop might have been a better gift for the guy if he wanted to do something nice for his wife on their anniversary.
That's helpful. That's helpful information. And it helps me understand why that wife was thinking, okay, how much did you really value our marriage that we're celebrating on our anniversary? Enough for the cheap old assembly line grocery store flowers or something like you just described? It seems like maybe what we're getting here is that motive matters and a sacrificial gift should really cost us something. What is our motive for our gifts to God? Are we just giving him leftovers out of our time, talent, and money? Or are we doing something that requires a real sacrifice on our part because we realize everything that he sacrificed for us?
And the impression that I get from all of this is everything that we do, every aspect of our lives can be a sacrificial offering to the Lord. I mean, we have our time, we have our talent, we have our treasure, our money, and we're admonished to do our very work as unto the Lord. So everything that we do, it's almost like our entire lifestyle is geared towards praising and sacrificing and offering our lives back to him because he paid the ultimate price so that we could be redeemed and become part of his family. So,
Wow.
I mean, it cost him everything. If it costs us a little, there's no comparison.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no kidding. I keep thinking back to some of the folks that I've run into in my life that demonstrated this sacrificial, costly kind of service to the Lord. And I even remember my dad, who was so patient, and bless his heart, he was preaching at a tiny little church west of Phoenix for a while. He was there for 8 years, and there was this lady there. She's in heaven now, God rest her soul. Her name was Lucille, and she had the gift of gab, and she had a lot of problems in her life that she needed to talk to somebody about. And I remember that just about the time that we would start to sit down to a nice hot supper that my mom had made, the phone would ring and dad would answer that phone. And I could tell by the look on his face that it was Lucille. And he would look at my mom like, I answered it. What can I do now? And she would just motion to us kids, go ahead and eat. And we'd sit down and eat. And dad would miss his hot meal because he'd be talking to Lucille for a good 30 or 40 minutes. But he did that because it was a sacrifice, not because he just couldn't say no, but because he had a sacrificial love for Lucille. And because Christ had sacrificed everything on my dad's behalf, he said, if Jesus can sacrifice himself for me, I can lay down my life a little bit for somebody else. And I know that that sounds silly, but for me, it wasn't. I noticed that as a kid, and I thought that was a real sacrificial gift on his part.
Yeah, I feel a great privilege of having known your dad. He to me was a saint-like person if I've ever met one. He just had the whole demeanor, the whole attitude, everything about him was a pure pastor at heart. Everything was for the flock.
Yeah.
And as you were talking about that, I reminded of someone who had the gift of giving. And as somebody who's much more selfish than that, because I don't really have that gift, but I saw them sacrifice financially on a regular basis. And that meant things like they didn't have a new car. They didn't live in a super nice house. It was a nice house. They were comfortable. It was a house that fit them, but they were always giving to something. If there was a special offering, they threw stuff in. We had to know that they were well beyond their tithe when their regular giving, but it was just something that they did. And you have to know that somebody who has that attitude is living out their faith, knowing that they are investing in the work of Christ, and they're storing up treasures far beyond that which we can even imagine in the next life.
Yeah. That's so cool. I'm thinking of a family just like the one you described here in Michigan too. And they are just like what you described. I'm privy to certain pieces of information at times that others aren't, because they may know of a specific need, but they want to remain anonymous. and they will help meet other people's needs. And that person who gets helped never knows that there was this very sacrificial gift made so that their need would be met. And I just love seeing that kind of stuff happening, because that really is an outpouring of their love for God expressed through their spiritual gift of giving that way. And it's a pretty impressive thing.
Yeah, and as you say, so often it's done anonymously. I remember a time we were living in Fort Worth. I was going to seminary. My wife was working, and she was working in the mall. One night she was there, just before closing, and this little kid came up to her and handed her an envelope and said, "This guy asked me to give this to you." And inside was $50. Well, at that time, $50 made a big difference in our lifestyle.
No
And it
kidding.
was totally anonymous. And it was just a gift that they gave to us because they knew we were not doing particularly well. No, we weren't hurting, but there were some things that we did without because of just the nature of our financial situation at that time. And all of a sudden, $50 shows up. And you have to think that the person who gave that, and I still don't know who it was, got a tremendous blessing out of that, just knowing that they were blessing us.
Isn't that cool? Yeah, this whole spiritual gifts thing is really weird that way, in a good way, because each of us form a team. And even though I don't possess certain skills or gifts that other people do, when they're exercising their specific gifts, it blesses all the rest of us, and they all function together. It's just a really cool thing. I'm thinking of one lady. She has the gift of hospitality, and she's such a great hostess. But for a season of her life, they didn't have the ability to have people into her own home. So instead, she thought, well, I know one way I can put that gift to use. I'll make home baked goods and bring them to our little cafe in the foyer at church every Sunday morning. And so we had this little cafe that she set up, and it was wonderful. And the foods that she made, they was unbelievably good. And they made it look inviting, and it had this inviting smell, aroma when you walked into the place, and it just made people want to come and be in that space and visit with each other just before we go in for worship. She was giving what she had to work with, and she thought that it didn't really amount to much. By the way she would talk about it, you'd think that it was no big deal. To us, it was a big deal.
And people don't realize that it's those little things, just the inviting aroma of baked goods just makes you feel really good.
Yeah.
And in that situation, it's 100% diametrically opposed to another example of that they do in the Disney parks. In the morning, when people are coming into the parks, early on before rope drop, they pump out the smell of cinnamon rolls into the street. So people will go into the bakery and buy them at the exorbitant prices that Disney charges. So they're using that smell to create cash flow. She, just in her own little way, was creating an inviting atmosphere so that the people coming into the church would feel welcome.
Wow.
A totally different way to go with that.
Motive.
Yeah, there you go. And the other thing you just said was how all of our gifts work together. We talked about those special ops teams, each one with a specialty skill. The same thing with the Christian life. We can't do it without each other because we have to have those other special skills to really enhance the way that ministry works.
I have asked myself on occasion, what would my community of faith look like if every other person in the community were gifted exactly as I was? I don't come up with a really good outcome when I take that to its conclusion.
You'd have a really crowded pulpit on Sunday morning.
Yes, we would. There would be nobody out there to listen. And there would be so many things left undone because we can only do a certain number of things. Everybody else has to do those things that they're good at so that all of us benefit. And I love it when that stuff happens and it comes together that way. Now, I did think that maybe one thing I should not take away from this Mighty Men of David story is that when I see this lady's gift of hospitality and I pick up one of her home-baked banana bread slices, I'm not going to throw it on the floor as a gift offering.
She might take that the wrong way.
Yeah, that's not how we're supposed to apply that particular passage. It has to do with the fact that it's a sacrificial gift as unto the Lord. And hers is that to us, so that as we're enjoying it, we actually do get to participate in that with her by eating it.
And we don't see at the Last Supper Jesus taking banana bread and throwing it on the floor. So I think we have a precedent here for not throwing the banana bread on the floor.
That's right. We just want to make it clear that sometimes we have to get the real understanding of what this means and then apply it to our current situation, our current culture. Well, another great story, a short one, but it is filled with meaning. And I'm grateful that we can learn from somebody like David, who had to learn some of it. Oh, there's our little puppy. Oh, there goes Poppy. Bye, Poppy. That we get to learn from King David, the guy who actually did have to learn a thing or two about not taking what doesn't belong to him because of the Bathsheba incident. But he did start to learn later on things like, I will not give to the Lord an offering which costs me nothing, which means that he was starting to get some of that. That was a very important knowledge. So the thing I want to take away from this story is I want to give God something that really matters, my time, my treasures, my talents. I want to give him something, even if it is costly to me, so that others will benefit, that Christ will be built up and his glory will be revealed to other people. And hopefully more people can see Christ in me and be drawn to Christ, not drawn to my own skills or abilities, my spidey senses or whatever, but that they're drawn to Christ in me, because Christ is the only one who can really make a difference and make their life purposeful and meaningful.
Yeah, I think the thing that we really see in here is that underlying theme of sacrifice.
Yeah.
We look at what we do and we go, oh yeah, that's going to hurt a little bit. Nothing in compared to the sacrifice that Christ made for us.
Yeah.
You know, there's probably some folks out there or other theologians that may be struggling with that a little bit, or maybe they've not ever entered in and really understood the results of that sacrifice. And perhaps it would be good to kind of walk through that a little bit and help them really understand that that sacrifice is everything, and all we have to do to make claim to our part of it is to understand it and accept it.
Yeah, that's good. We always want to leave on a positive note about this gospel, which is so deep that even the angels look into it and they're baffled by it, as we are, because we can never quite comprehend the graciousness of a God that would give himself up on our behalf when we don't deserve it. It just seems so counterintuitive compared to what we get from the world. But that's the thing. God knows that we're separated from him because of our sin and our selfishness, but he wants to create a bridge to get back to him. And it's an uncrossable bridge apart from what Christ did for us. Jesus becomes that bridge. He fills that chasm, and we get to walk across on him because of what he did for us on the cross, so that we can be reunited, reconnected with God. And that's what the gospel is about, so that his sacrifice, his death, brings us life. His death on a cross pays the penalty for sin, which we could not pay in our own strength. Therefore, we just need to accept it. And so it's a gift. And all we have to do to appropriate it is to say, I can't do it in my own strength. I confess that. Please forgive me. Come into my life. Be my spiritual guide for the rest of my life and for eternity. And he does that. And I'd like to lead us in a sample prayer if somebody would like to take that step. It would go something kind of like this. Lord, I recognize what you've done for me is incredible, and it's hard for me to comprehend it, but I want it because I recognize that I can't get to you any other way except through Christ. And so I ask for his forgiveness. I thank you for it. And I commit my life to him, living my life for him, knowing that he is giving me the ability to become more like him because he gives me his spirit. Thank you for that. And thank you for starting the work and for promising to finish that work, because it's going to be a lifetime journey with you. And because of that journey, I'll be able to be with you in eternity, that new heaven and new earth that you've promised us forever. And I thank you for that. In Jesus' name, amen.
Amen.
And the more we look into that, the deeper it gets, and the more we can't fathom it, but the more we want it. It's just this wonderful upward spiral of wanting more of him, because it gets deeper. And the more we know of him, the more his grace astounds us, and it gets bigger and bigger, and we just keep getting to know more of his grace. So it's worth looking
Yeah.
into.
I think that's a good word. It is astounding, and we are astounded
Yeah.
all the time
Yep.
as we look into even a simple story like we looked at today.
Right. Yeah, it's good. Good to look into it. And it's good to hang out with you and look into things like that with my fellow theologian and with you fellow theologians as well.
Are we going to maybe be back and do this again next week?
Looking at the weather report, I give it a 98% chance positive. Yes, we're going to be back next week.
All right.
So we do hope that you're going to be joining us again in this
Season 2.
as we continue to look at humor in the Bible, and come back and join us for another episode of
Monday afternoon theologians.
Theologians.